Hello, boys and girls, and everyone in between and beyond. I want to teach you guys today this method that I use sometimes in tracks where it's like a loudness hierarchy method. Based on what you want them to focus on is how you're going to set up this chain of plugins. And it's all going to be using Soothe and using the sidechain function inside Soothe here. So in most songs, the hierarchy is generally you want the drums and the vocals to be the loudest things in the song because that's what gives it its groove. And then you want the hi-hats because, you know, that's part of the drums. But you generally want the kick and the snare to be louder than the hi-hats and everything. Depending on the genre, I'm sure there are some genres that are different. Maybe you want the snare to be a little bit louder than the kick drum. I make mostly EDM stuff, so you want your kick and your snare to be louder than your hi-hats. And you want your hi-hats to be louder than the high end of your instruments. If your hi-hats are louder than your instruments, you're allowing the hi-hats to dictate the rhythm and dictate the groove of the song. You may not want that, but if you do want that, this setup will work. If you don't want that, then you can even have the instruments above the hi-hats using this method if you swap around the sidechains here. So let's just get into it. I'll actually quickly play the whole loop here so you get a feel for how it sounds. So this part doesn't really matter because it doesn't have the drums or the hi-hats, but this is just I got a little carried away and decided to make some fun outro thing. Basically, in this setup here, on my hi-hats, so this is my tops bus here, which is where I'm going to put all my hi-hats. I've got Soothe on here, and the Soothe is sidechaining, and it's sidechaining from the drums. So whenever the drums play, and because it's mostly just the snare, is going to duck parts of the spectrum. Now, without the snare, you can hear a bit of the, I don't know what you would consider that, like a whipping sound in this loop. But because I have Soothe on here, it's dampening that a little bit and allowing the snare to really cut through and not be overpowered by the little perk sound. So if I turn this off, it's very subtle. It's very subtle, but it allows the snare to breathe. So we can overdo this a little bit. You don't want it to be completely out of the way to where you hear no hi-hats, but if we've got nothing, then we bring up this depth. Notice how when the snare hits, there are frequencies that are ducking in that high end. And you can make it a lot more apparent if you turn the release up here. But that's a bit extreme. So something around 4 or 5. And then normally I look over here, there's the meter here that's like -6. If it's taking more than -6, these are just bad sounds to be using in conjunction with each other. So you might want to just EQ the tops yourself. But to be honest, -6 dB is probably a good middle ground to where you're going to get it to meld and sit nicely with each other. This also has an effect of the drums pumping and making them sound like they're part of the same kit, because in real life, when a kick and a snare hit, they're really loud in real life. If you've ever been to a live concert or any sort of live venue, when a kick is played, it literally pushes the other frequencies out of the way. So acoustically, it's basically sidechaining the sound. And so this is kind of mimicking that, but more for the snare. So another cool thing is, if I hop over to my instrument bus, I also have a Soothe set up here that is pulling from the kick. So if we solo the kick, it's dropping out some of that Well, it's mostly majority the low end here that is pulling out, and then a bit of the 1K, 2K. And I don't want the high end to really disappear, because if I had this fully out, it would pull the snare in too. Which could be what you want depending on your track, but I personally didn't like that. So I just grabbed mostly the kick. And now I want to layer hi-hats on top of this. Even though that this sound already has a bunch of high end from the lead that I'm using in this loop here, I think the hi-hats could sit over it better. So if I turn the soothe off, which is grabbing from the hi-hats. So currently this is off. It's a bit busy, right? But we drop the soothe on there, and because I'm pulling sidechain from the hi-hats, it's going to give room on the instrument bus to allow the hi-hats to occupy that space that's filled. And like before, we can emphasize it even more if we want more of that. But what I would recommend is maybe going a little overboard and then dragging it back until you like how it sounds. So if you think of this, it's almost EQing, and like this is like automatic mixing, because it's looking at the resonant frequencies of the different channels, and because of the way you stack them, certain instruments or certain tracks or groups are going to take priority. So as of right now, our drums are taking priority. They're also sidechained to the hi-hats. And because they're sidechained to the hi-hats, the snare is going to get out of the way of the hi-hats. Sorry, the hi-hats are going to get out of the way of the snare. Because the sidechain on our instrument bus is to the hi-hats, the high end of the instruments are going to get out of the way for the hi-hats. One thing that's kind of a problem in a lot of EDM tracks is that the groove gets lost because the actual instruments themselves have way too much high end in them, and you don't have enough rhythmic cohesion, and you kind of lose the beat a little bit. So this helps make the high end nice and tidy and allows your hi-hats and your groove to really cut through, and you don't really get confused as to what things you should be paying attention to, especially rhythmically. All right, so just to prove how cool this is, I'm going to mute these hats, and I'm going to turn on like a drum and bass hi-hat loop. Like this is just dragged in, and I have the transient mode turned on, because without it, we can leave it off for now just to hear how it sounds in the mix here. But this is completely just dragged in. No pre-EQing or anything like that. This is just dragged straight in. And with my setup here, with the Soothe setup, it should just work. There shouldn't be any real clashing frequencies. And if there is, Soothe will take care of it. That's pretty cool. All right, let's say I want to add more of the hi-hats that I had before. Say I want to add everything. I don't have to EQ anything to make sure any frequencies are out of the way. Soothe is going to do it for me automatically. Okay, let's just drag in another hi-hat loop here. Let's see, net, top loop. We'll just throw this in there at random, just to prove how powerful this setup is. Just works. Anything you throw in here is automatically going to be EQ'd correctly for you. As long as you set up these channels and the sidechains correctly, you should have no problem. And you basically don't have to mix as long as you're using, samples that sound good. All right, so here's another example that I want to show you, and this is a completely different genre, but it's the same exact project file. So this is literally the sounds here that you were just listening to, and then here is a drum and bass version. And it's a completely different style of music, but I'm doing this to prove how versatile this chain is. No matter what genre you're working on, this should work. Just works. Let's throw in the loop from the other style and throw that on top. I mean, it fits. It fits perfectly. But the problem is, I mean, I don't really like the rhythm to this this loop, so maybe we'll try a different one. So I'm intentionally grabbing samples from a different genre to prove that no mixing is required. But let's say I did want to add more high end to these, or I wanted to EQ it differently. It'll just work. Let me try to quickly explain exactly what you need to do in order to set this up. So we'll have a kick, and we'll have a snare channel, or whatever you want to be the most prominent. If you're going to do a vocal, I would have vocal as well. And generally, you're not going to duck the drums for the vocal, but you'll duck everything else. So we'll have this. We can name this drums. This will be vocal. And then we'll have our hi-hats. So maybe we'll have like 3 channels. And we'll name this tops. And then we'll name this here. This will be our instruments. So we'll group these. And we'll make instruments. So we've got our drums, a vocal, tops, and instruments here. Let me group these and just close that so we don't get confused. Right? And now on our drums, we don't need anything. We just need like a drum loop. So we'll just use this. Okay, this will be our drums. Good measure. I'm just going to remove the hi-hats. And then we'll grab another top loop here. Let's put that one on there. So we're going to put this in our tops here. And in our instruments, let's grab an instrument. All right, cool. So we've got our sounds. So let's get our soothe set up here. So we'll grab soothe. We'll make sure we turn the sidechain on. I forget to do that sometimes. And we pull from the drums. And depending on what you want, I kind of want a bit of the snare to be in there. And we're going to turn our attack down. And we're going to turn our release up to maybe 2. And then we'll turn the link to about 50%. That's personal preference. And I have my sharpness up maybe to 2 and our selectivity all the way down. And what this will do when we have our kick playing here, and make sure we select from the drums here, and we select from the new drums, we'll turn our depth up to taste. Okay. So we've got about 6 dB of gain reduction. So when the snare hits here, we're going to have the snare. We can see the snare is pushing the other snare in the sample out of the way. Okay, now we'll move on to the instruments here. We'll throw another soothe on there. We're going to put it on hard mode, and maybe we'll put it up to 2. Want to get rid of mostly just the kick here, and bring the sharpness up a little bit, selectivity all the way down. We'll bring our linking down. We'll grab from the drums as well. For the instruments, you probably want your kick to be ducking a lot further. So you could potentially go really hard for the kick and then let up a little bit for the snare. Now we'll move on to the hi-hats. Now we want to sidechain the hi-hats to the instruments. So we'll pull from the tops, we'll turn sidechain on, have the release up a little bit on hard mode, same settings. And we're going to restrict this to mostly the high end here. For hi-hats, it might be better to bring the sharpness up a little bit. So now that we've got that, we can throw on even more hats here. This is just a different genre. This is drum and bass. And let's add some more high end to this. And you can see I'm boosting 10 dB of high end, and the hi-hats still have room because of this soothe here. If I didn't, if you don't have headphones on or your speakers aren't that good, you might not be able to tell. The hi-hats are really hard to pay attention to if this soothe isn't on. Like, because this instrument has a bit of like rhythm to it, your ears are drawn to that. So with this soothe on, it's not really as distracting, right? You can kind of pay more attention to the hi-hats, and that's literally what mixing is about. It's what do you want your listener to pay attention to, right? And if it's supposed to be a background thing, you want it to be a background thing. If it's not a main element and you're not supposed to be perceiving it, and you are perceiving it, then you're doing a bad job at mixing. That's basically what the setup is trying to do for you, just automatically. It's you group them in a hierarchy and you choose which elements should be on top. For the vocal, because I didn't set this up, generally what I would do is I would take the either tops and instruments. Normally I want to leave the drums by themselves, right? And I'll just name this either sidechain or instruments or main, whatever that is. We'll put another soothe on there. So on channel main, and that has our instruments and our tops in there. And what we're going to do is we're going to pull sidechain from the vocal, turn on sidechain and soothe. And a similar thing that we did to everything else is we're going to sidechain the vocal. What this will do is when the vocal is playing, and only when the vocal is playing, are the frequencies of the vocal going to be pushed out of the way. And I'm sure you've seen videos of this. There were a lot of videos that were talking about this, but this method that I'm telling you is kind of like taking it to another step here. It's a really, really awesome concept for vocals, but I figured if it works for vocals, audio is just audio, so it's going to work for everything, right? So if you want to do the same thing for your instruments, for your hi-hats, you could do the exact same thing. If there's too much high end on your instruments and you don't want to go in there and EQ, surgically every little frequency that's clashing, throw a soothe on there and you're good to go. Try this out. See what you think. If you get something cool with it, post it in the Discord. If not, post it in the Discord anyway. Maybe we can help you make it sound cooler. And if you like this video, leave a like. And I'm going to try to make way more videos for you guys, give you guys as many secrets as I possibly can. I have a couple cool things up my sleeve still that I am waiting to drop, and I hope you found it useful. Thank you guys so much.